Hi, everyone. So I've created this video for my virtual exchange partners. And in this video, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the topic that we cover in my developmental psychology course. It's the topic of self-concept and self-esteem. So hopefully, after viewing this video, you will be ready to participate in our virtual exchange together. Here we go. So self-concept and self-esteem. In infancy, children have to develop physical and also social self-awareness, essentially to become aware of the fact that we are all separate, but also able agents to act on our environment. However, it is not until children can verbally describe who they think they are that we can say that children have developed a self-concept. So a self-concept we could define is as a set of beliefs about who we are as individuals. During preschool years, children tend to describe themselves in terms of what they can do or how they look. So it is mostly based on physical, external characteristics. They're also very aware of their gender, racial identity, ethnic identity. Again, so their self-concept, again, is based mainly on physical characteristics, the skin color, a length of one's hair. Typically, a preschooler's self-concept is not also very accurate and even overly optimistic. And this is because they do not yet compare their performance to others. And psychologists believe that this is actually a good thing. It keeps them motivated to try different activities and explore and develop new skills. By middle childhood and adolescence, children think of themselves and have a self-concept based more on now psychological traits rather than external physical characteristics. They also become more aware of how other people perceive them, and they may describe based on both, in terms of how others perceive them and also how they perceive themselves. This shift in essentially in self-concept is attributed to the advances in adolescents' cognitive development, their ability to think in more abstract terms, more advanced understanding of others' perspectives. Gender, race, ethnicity are all part of a self-concept. However, preschoolers may show mixed feelings about their race or ethnicity, especially minority children. That's what research shows. Many minority children experience ambivalence over the meaning of their racial identity. Some may even experience race dissonance, which is when minority children prefer the values and norms of the majority. This may be particularly true for children who are adopted to parents and siblings of a different race and ethnicity. During middle childhood, children begin to self-identify more with more psychological traits, as already mentioned, and put less emphasis on physical ones. Now, again, this is essentially attributed to the advancement in cognitive development. In my class, we cover Piaget cognitive developmental theory, where we learn, according to this theory, that children develop in middle school, around middle school, concrete operational cognitive skills, which essentially allows them to begin to think more in abstract terms. self-concept becomes more differentiated when children during middle childhood and adolescence. And usually the children might have a set of non-academic and self-academic set of self-concepts. So children don't just think of themselves as there are a different set of, like I said, the descriptions that they view themselves in different ways when it comes to academic schoolwork and non-academic schoolwork. Interestingly, some studies show that girls seem to associate academic performance with their gender identity and boys don't. And this may explain why girls on average do better academically than boys. Essentially because girls believe that performing well academically is what girls are supposed to do. They probably put more effort into their schoolwork, while boys who don't see school success as boy congruent with their identity, they are less likely to put more effort into schoolwork. Self-concept, and sometimes it's also called, we could say, self-identity, becomes even more central issue during adolescence. If again, one of the theories that we cover in this course is Erikson's psychosocial theory of personality. And according to that theory, developing a clear set of identity is the central task during this specific stage during adolescence. Adolescents are able to recognize the difference between the perception of self by others and their own perception of self. I did already mention that. That according to, again, Erikson's theory, a teen who failed to develop a coherent self-identity may adopt socially unacceptable roles, which may lead to maladjustment and also more risky behavior, may have trouble forming meaningful relationships. So again, according to Erikson's theory, it is essential that an adolescent develops a coherent, clear self-concept or self-identity. However, one of the criticisms of Erikson's theory is that he neglected the potential cultural differences that assuming essentially that this is all universal and there's no the universally important self-identity development during adolescence. Whether that is true or not, I believe more research is needed. Now, this research suggests that our self-concept can be influenced by our environment, by the messages that we receive from our environment, from people in our environment. To show this, there was a study done here. I'm citing Ullman, Oyserman, 2012. So the study showed experimentally that by cueing boys with a message of academic success as being boy congruent identity, boys' attitudes about school and their school performance can be improved. That was their hypothesis. And so in their experiment, they showed boys a graph displaying earnings of men and women, where males were shown to be earning more money. And this was essentially a message intended to link to let the boys at school education and future success is related to their gender identity, that it should be part of their gender identity. For girls, girls were shown a different graph in the condition with girl in a separate condition. So girls was shown a graph displaying a higher graduation rate for girls, and this meant to reaffirm again the fact or that education is part of girls' self-concept. That it's academic performance is congruent, is part of the girl's identity. And results of the experiment confirmed both that both girls and boys' self-concept included self-focused behavior if they were shown those messages that were congruent with their gender. So some of the examples, for example, that both boys and girls imagined themselves to be more successful as adults as the result of this manipulation. Again, only if they were exposed to the graph showing success pertaining to their gender. So what the study suggests is that self-concept, in this case, gender identity, can be influenced by our environment and what we see and hear, I guess, around us. And it could be a positive, could be a negative, of course, effect. Studies also find that there's gender differences in the kinds of academic self-concepts that boys and girls may have as part of their identity. For example, boys tend to have higher self-concept in classes like math and sports, and girls tend to have higher self-concept, or tend to include the courses that part of their self-concept as languages and arts. And we see that these differences are also positively correlated with the career choices that boys and girls make later as adults. So if self-concept can affect one's attitudes, motivation, behavior, then we can also explain why more males choose careers in math and sciences, and girls choose careers associated with more like with languages and arts. Now, in my class, we also I gave them studies suggesting that self-concept, there might be differences in self-concept between cultures, say individualistic and collectivistic cultures. So if we consider again the dimension of individualism, collectivism, so individualistic cultures are cultures where it's more oriented towards the oneself, the uniqueness of the self, high focus on the self, basically, whereas collectivistic cultures are the cultures orienting more towards the connectedness, toward being part of a group. So there's some studies suggesting that the differences in this cultures based on collectivism and individualism dimension can also influence our self-concept. Essentially, if you're growing up in an individualistic culture, you're more likely to have, I guess, individualistic oriented self, which is essentially emphasis on, again, uniqueness of oneself and promoting independence, uniqueness, how the self that is different from others. So your self-concept may be more about how you are different from other people. Whereas the collective, so someone who's is growing up in the collective culture, their self-concept, though, is more likely to be what would be collectivist self-concept, is self which is embedded within your social group. So you might think of yourself and describe yourself more in terms of as being part of that group. What's all some studies have found that the collectivistic self, or the way you view yourself as being your self as a part of the group membership, can also vary from perhaps different from the kinds of people that you are around, or part of, or the groups, the social groups that you are part of. So the self is more prone to changes. So you might see yourself, or you describe your different ways. So it's not constant. Whereas those who have more of an individualistic oriented self, your self remains more constant. Now, self-esteem is a different but very related concept. At around middle childhood, children begin to evaluate themselves, which is what essentially is self-esteem is. When, unlike self-concept that describes who we are, self-esteem has an emotional and evaluative tone to who we are. So we may think of ourselves in terms of both sometimes positive and negative ways, depending on what aspects of our identity we are evaluating. But we also sometimes you hear the term positive self-esteem or negative self-esteem. So if someone has a more positive evaluation of themselves, then we could say that they have a positive self-esteem. And if someone has a more negative view of themselves, then we could say it's a negative self-esteem. Now, the question many psychologists have raised is whether self-esteem is good for us. And actually research, if you look at correlational studies, they do find a positive correlation between having, say, high or positive self-esteem and many life outcomes. For example, relationship satisfaction, job satisfaction, mentally, even physical health, income, occupation. Of course, the problem with such correlational studies is that they're not telling us what cause and what is the cause and what is the effect of that. So it could be, one can say, because maybe people with better health, better mental health may have, that helps them to have a more positive self-esteem. So that's one potentially alternative explanation. However, there are some studies that in fact suggest that in fact positive self-esteem can also have a causal effect on our development in life. So it can be good. For example, there's a longitudinal study that shows that people with positive or high self-esteem tend to have all those other good things in their life, and this potentially, so positive self-esteem can have that effect on us. So you're less likely to develop a depression, and again, you're more likely to have relationship satisfaction, better health. Another question is whether the focus on self-esteem is culture specific or it's universal. So in Western cultures, we do emphasize, and in fact, we try to develop positive self-esteem. So in Western cultures, it is highly valued. But the question is whether in non-Western cultures and other cultures, it may not be as important. So is that important for all humans, or is it culture specific? And there's some back and forth. Some will argue that it's culture specific, so it's cultural relativism, that in maybe individualistic cultures, self-esteem is highly valued because it helps people to stand out, to be promoted. So it's a good thing to be very unique. But maybe it's not so important, or even maybe not so good for, say, in the collectivistic society. So, but there's some studies suggesting that it might be a universal thing. At least for example, one experiment, subjects were asked to allocate money among the three selves: the individual, the relational self, and the collective self. So basically, they asked the subjects, and those subjects were from UK and Hong Kong. And they wanted to see to which part of yourself, would the subject allocate more money, which would indicate how much they value each one of those cells. There's the descriptions were, this is the descriptions for the individual self, relational self, and collective self. So this is what they were given as far as the description. And then they were asked to think of what would be your unique self, what would be your relational self, what would be your collective self. And what they found was that both groups allocated more money to the individual self, which suggests that both cultures showed more value, that they valued more their individual self than any other selves. So I guess the takeaway is that self-esteem seems to play a positive role by making people feel good about themselves, giving them more confidence in their work and relationships. It appears to be important for people of potentially different cultures, not just the Western cultures. However, we do need more research with studying different cultures. For example, there's really not much research pertaining to people of Latino cultures, Middle Eastern culture. So I would say the question of cultural universality of self-esteem is still remains. It still needs to be investigated more. And that will be it. Thank you very much.